So what is the big idea? I'm going to suggest to you that there are three essential commitment elements to this. The first is that we are going to look at the world through a different lens, a relational lens that we're probably not very familiar with using and that has more implications than perhaps we generally recognize. Secondly, I'm going to talk about relationships not just as a means to an end, but as the end itself. Again, I think we're used to the idea of using relationships to achieve some other purpose, such as increased profits or some political career move or whatever it may be. I want to introduce the idea of relationships as an end in itself. And thirdly, I want to talk about the importance of mapping and measuring relationships. And that's part of making relationships our end goal rather than just a means to an end. And I want to ask the question, do we really need a paradigm shift? What's the point of coming up with a new set of ideas like this at a time when we seem extraordinarily prosperous in the world and we seem to have a technological revolution going on around us which is quite enough to cope with without shifting the goalposts? So I'm going to very quickly run through, first of all, the argument as to why we need a paradigm shift, why this is a supremely important moment of change. So this is going to go rather quickly. You're going to have to concentrate, I'm afraid. First of all, think about the demographic challenge. My friend Jonathan Tame pointed me to the importance of demographics. They underlie everything, but because they don't affect us next year, a 2 or 3% change in population doesn't shift anything next year, does it? But over 20, 30 years, it certainly does. And countries like Singapore and Hong Kong are losing about 35% of their workforce every 30 years. Japan, Germany probably losing 35% of their workforce every 40 years. Switzerland, about the same. You're a long way short of a self-sustaining population. That means if you want to keep up your population, large-scale immigration, like we're seeing in Germany and in Singapore at the moment, but that disturbs local domestic political stability. Families are fracturing. We heard last night about the problems with the natural ecology. I would want to argue that the social ecology is in worse shape than the natural ecology, that extended families and nuclear families are shattering and scattering. And that has immense implications because if governments haven't got enough money to pay the welfare bill, who is going to look after all those needy individuals? Think about levels of youth unemployment. Those are 2014 figures, and they're a severe underestimate. If you were to take the 1980 definitions of unemployment, they'd be substantially higher than that. This is 16 to 24-year-olds. But many, many of those people will never, ever have a job. In the past, the unemployment was something temporary. By the time people were 30, most people were in work. But most of those people, many of those people will never, ever have a job. Doesn't that suggest to you something is fundamentally flawed? That we need something different if we're going to take the world forward to another century in peace? My friend Paul Mills, who's coming on a little later, quarrels with me about this slide, and he's doubtless right because he's a much better economist than I am, because I'm comparing turnover of multinationals with GDP of countries, and that isn't strictly right. But I hope you take the point that some of these very large companies have such massive turnovers and such massive size that they are uncontrollable by national governments. And when we put corporations above governments and above any form of international accountability, then I think we are asking some big questions of ourselves. Are we trusting the people who run these corporations to look after our world for us because they have such immense power? And we should not underestimate that. This is an attempt to illustrate the size of the wealth and income differentials. It's the income differentials that I'm focused on here. I'm sure you all know that the managing director of Tesco gets 500 times the salary of the girl on the checkout. And the point I'm making, whether it's a boy or a girl on checkout, is kind of immaterial to this. What the point I'm making is that you have to work 500 years on the checkout, 500 years on the checkout to get the salary of the chief executive of the company. Now, is that justice? Is that the kind of world we want? All men are created equal, and women too. But is that equality, to have that kind of pay differential? Do we feel comfortable with it? Is it any surprise that 70% of employees globally are disengaged from the companies where they work? Think of financial stability. We are living on the edge of a precipice. Think of debt levels in the US, China, the European Union, Japan. It goes on and on. Think of the amount of money being printed by our central banks, by the European Central Bank, by the Fed, and so on. It's no wonder that we are in such a financially unstable world. Look at these levels of national debt. I've made it a percentage of tax revenue rather than a percentage of GDP, because obviously if national debt's going to be repaid, it's not going to be repaid directly by you and me. It's going to be repaid indirectly through our taxes or through the income that the government is able to generate. But just look at those levels of debt. Greece already up to nearly 500% of its tax revenue, 5 times its tax revenue. Britain 2.5 times its total annual tax revenue. I think we all just have to realize that it's never going to be repaid. So either we're going to steal it from our neighbors through hyperinflation or some other means. We're either going to steal it or we're going to default, which is effectively becomes another form of stealing, or we're going to land it onto our children and grandchildren, and they were never asked as to whether they were willing to have this debt. Of course, there's the myth that economic prosperity is going to come back and we'll create all these surpluses and then we'll pay it back, but we've had plenty of time to do that. We've had plenty of opportunity in this country with surpluses to repay debt, and we never did it. All we're trying to do at the moment is lower the percentage annual increase in our debt. We're not even yet to a point where we've got a balanced budget, and that still seems to be drifting further and further away. And the political challenge. The only thing we ask people to do in the political arena is to vote once every 5 years. But the number of people who vote is, if you're lucky, 50% of the population, and it's falling every year. So people, in terms of political engagement, are not even able to manage one vote every 5 years or so. And then we have the challenge of identity politics. I don't know if you know the flag on the right. Anybody know the flag on the right? Catalonia. Yeah, my goodness, I've got an informed audience here. Thank you. And the one on the left, even I can manage. It's Scotland. Identity politics is rising. How do you feel if you're Spanish and the Catalonians, which is the most prosperous part of Spain, I think, is wanting to withdraw? How do you feel about that? How do you feel if you're English, if you keep hearing Scottish people saying we want to get out from under you English? I can understand it, actually I have some sympathy with them on that, but it isn't a sort of a very comfortable relational space to be in. Or think about what's going on with technology. I'm comparing there a Ford assembly line with a modern cockpit of a modern aeroplane. Think of the number of components required to build the cockpit of a modern airplane, to manufacture those controls. Think of the number of relationships involved in putting all of those components together. Or think about the iPhone, the iPad, the i-everything world we're moving into. The use of the letter I, of course, is highly significant. It is about the individual, and everyone is engaged in their own individual way, but what is that doing to the relationships of our societies? And what I'm wanting to say is that all of these challenges are in front of us. All of them seem to me to demand a different way of thinking, a different way of living, and they all have causes and consequences in the field of relationships. And we're just going to explore some of that in the next few minutes and how relational thinking seeks to tackle that. So going back to what I said at the beginning, relational thinking is a different lens. It's not just a means of achieving something, but the goal to which you aspire, the end. And it's about mapping and measuring. So just looking first at a different way to see the world. And I apologize if you've seen my microwave illustration before. It's just the simplest one I have. I could have used a police car. I could have used a host of other ways of illustrating this point, but I always come back to this one just because it's the simplest and something that people seem to remember. So you can think about a microwave in terms of what it costs to buy or to run. You can look at it from an environmental point of view. What are its carbon emissions relative to conventional cooking? Or you can look at it in terms of your personal convenience through an individual lens. How good is this for me? But how many of us, when we bought a microwave, thought about the relationship implications of having a microwave in our house? 25% of British homes now do not have a table around which a family can eat a meal or a household can eat a meal. 25% of British homes do not have a table around which you can eat a meal together, because people come in, they zap their food in the microwave, then they go to watch the television, they go to their room, they spread out across the house, and the consequence is there is a lack of conversation. And one of the great enemies of building relationships is if you lose conversation. Conversation is key to building relationships across all sectors of society. If you're in a prison, the conversation between the prison officers and the prisoners is key. If you're in a school, the conversations are key, but we don't have time for meal times at school anymore. We want to do more physics and maths in order to raise our scores on international student assessments. But we're losing conversation all the time. Now, here are some examples of issues that, hopefully it will come up. Here are some examples of issues where I suggest we either tend to think about things financially or individualistically. So take the word development. What do we mean by development? Well, I think most of us still think of development really as being about GDP. So a developed country is one with a high income. An underdeveloped or developing country is one with a low income. So you see, we've taken the idea of development and we immediately have put it in terms of finance, income, economics, and so on. But are you really better off in a country which is richer financially, but whose relationships, families, and communities are falling apart, or where you've got increased polarization going on between rich and poor? Is the United States really the richest country in the world? Or from a relational perspective, is it in fact one of the poorest countries in the world? Well, I hope I'm not offending any Americans present if I suggest it is relationally one of the poorest countries, and that is a better way to think about it. Perhaps some of the African countries that we think of as, quotes, poor, because they're financially poor, are actually rich. Think of your definition of poverty. Do you think of poverty as a financial condition primarily? Poverty is about having a small income, isn't it? Well, is it? Or is the fact that someone has got a lack of supportive relationships, in fact, more significant than having a lack of income? Now, there's a big overlap between relational poverty and financial poverty, but it really matters which of those you prioritize. Maybe some of the poorest people in the world are down the road in Cambridge, where they're living very isolated lives in an old people's home. Maybe they're worse off than the people I worked with in Indian and African villages who were financially poor, but actually relationally quite rich. And think about rights. I really am concerned that rights is becoming a charter for selfishness. It's all about me, what society owes me. That's the whole emphasis of the way the rights discourse is going. So we've developed the concept of relational rights, which takes into account the effect of rights on third parties. And my children say I managed to get Sunday trading into every talk, so here it comes. Sunday shopping is increasingly viewed individualistically. Sunday shopping is about my right to go shopping when I choose at my convenience. It's not about whether the people who live above the shops are disturbed. It's not about whether the shop worker wants to have a day with their family. I was talking to a shop worker down in Newnham where I live, and she said, I already work Saturdays, now they want me to work all day Sundays. The more they change the law, the more work they want me to do at weekends. When am I meant to see my kids? When am I meant to see my partner in my family? How do I maintain those relationships? The kids are out at school all day on weekdays, and I'm not at home at weekends. Now, if one moves from there to trying to make relationships as ends as well as means to an end, it does become increasingly important to think about how you measure them, because if you can't measure them, you can't rationalize interventions. You can't measure whether an intervention's been effective. So why invest money into an initiative if you don't know whether it's been successful or not? And also, if relationships are going to be part of the goal of companies, as well as obviously the financial results and the environmental considerations, then surely we have to have some way of effectively measuring them. And how do you measure something as complex as a relationship? I don't know if you've ever tried describing a relationship with a close friend and just sit down and write everything you can think about, but it does take a considerable length of time. So a key concept for measurement we came up with was the idea of relational distance. You can see from the picture on the left that if somebody is some distance away, this is rather primitive technology being used on the left-hand side, the message isn't particularly clear or distinct, whereas if you're face-to-face, as you are on the right, the communication is a much happier process and causes much more pleasure in life, and it's also much more effective. So we've come up with some categories and language for assessing and measuring relationships, and also being able to assess the impact of government decisions on the way people are relating. So there are 5 domains of relationship which are set out there. All relationships operate in 5 domains. Now, at one level, this is painfully obvious, isn't it? All relationships involve communication. They all involve time or story. The past affects the relationship, and the expectation of the future affects the relationship. They all involve information. How wide or deep is your knowledge of the other party? They all involve power. Power comes into every relationship in some way or other, whether people participate in decisions, whether they feel that rules are applied fairly to both sides, whether there's a fair sharing of risk and reward. All of those things come into the power dimension. And purpose. Purpose is about whether we have shared goals and so on. So all of those 5 exist simultaneously in any relationship you can think of, whether it's between organizations, between nations, between ethnic groups, or just between individuals and in families. They all occur simultaneously, and that is painfully obvious. And I'm fond of telling the story of Ross Gittins, the economics editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, who once said to me, "Michael, I think you're a genius." And I thought, yeah, well, that sounds pretty good. I'll go with that. And then he said, "And a genius is the first person to tell you the blindingly obvious." And that brought me back to size. So we talk about relational proximity, which is the opposite of relational distance, relational closeness. This was all language developed in the R factor in 1993. And we say that to have relational proximity, you need directness of communication. Face-to-faceness gives you much more information in a conversation than a telephone call. And a telephone call gives you more than an email, because at least in a telephone call you get the tone of voice even though you don't get the facial expressions. So why don't we do all relationships face to face? And that's because you need more time for a face-to-face meeting, because you've got to travel to get there, like you've all traveled to get here. And as you all know, that takes a lot of time. And time is our scarcest resource. Time is a scarcer resource than money. You cannot increase the quantity of your time. So the most critical decisions you make in your life, I suggest, are how you prioritize your use of time. Because the people that you spend time with now are going to have the biggest influence on your life in 5 years' time, probably. So directness of communication is key, continuity in the story, and yet we still have such mobile societies where we uproot people from one community to another without thinking twice about the relational consequences of those decisions. We have an idea of externality in economics, but we don't think about the relational externalities of mobility. Information, we talk about multiplexity, the many-sidedness of information, how much you know about the other person's goals and ambitions and background and training, and how much also in an organizational context you know what the goals are of the other organization and how they're going about achieving them. In a business context, whether they're cash rich or cash poor, and so on. In the power context, it's not about equality, but about parity, and purpose is about shared goals and values, as I said, and we call that commonality. So relational thinking can be taken on board at a number of different levels. At one level, you can think about it as a personal and family agenda. I'm now checking my watch, see how I'm doing. Yes, I'm all right, for a little longer. It's about roots, about whether you and your extended family have some roots in place. And that's pretty complex in the modern world, because if you've been highly mobile like me and my immediate family, how do we reconnect with the extended family, some of whom, I've got one member of my extended family in the room, so I'm sure she's going to take this up with me later. Do I stay with my roots in Cambridge, where I've been 30 years? Do I reconnect with the extended family south of London? But rootedness and place is crucial for long-term relationships with extended family, and extended family are crucial, I suggest, for welfare, particularly if you imagine the government basically withdrawing from the field of welfare in the future, as I imagine will happen. Work-life balance. Do you stay longer in the office to get relational benefits by having longer with your boss, with your colleagues, with your clients or whoever? Or do you go home and concentrate on having stronger relationships with your family and friends? Take the idea of forgiveness. If you are unwilling to forgive, you create enormous relational distance between yourself and the person that you are not forgiving. So forgiveness becomes a very central issue if you're interested in a relational family or a relational society. And in my experience, I think the most difficult relationships to forgive are those in your family. So immediate, close relationships, the forgiveness issue just gets bigger and bigger and more important. But forgiveness applies in the workplace as well, not just between individuals, but between organizations and groups. And I've already mentioned conversation. How do you cultivate conversation? I remember years ago when my kids were teenagers, I would race home from the office, because we always would eat together round the table at 7 o'clock, and I would screech in on my bike at about 1 minute to 7 and pat myself on the back for what a brilliant job I'd done and what a fantastic dad I was to be home on time for supper. The only thing was that I didn't give any thought to what we would discuss over the mealtime. And given the fact that I now believe that meal times in families are more important than board meetings in companies, generally, isn't it extraordinary that we'll spend hours preparing for board meetings, but we won't even spend 5 minutes preparing for a mealtime with family members? Doesn't that strike you as odd if you stop and think about it? But is it because we just don't rate conversations over mealtimes as that important, so we're willing to let them all happen totally ad hoc? But maybe we should give that a little more thought. We're going to hear tonight about the relational teacher from Rob Lowe and the other people who've been invited to that event, not least our visiting speaker. But think about the goals of a school. What is the message we send to kids when they go to school? What is the goal of education? Well, read government documents. It's all about the personal development of the child. And of course, there's something good and right about that. But the message we're giving to kids is that school is all about you. The education is all about you. It's about your career, your development, your opportunities, your future income. It's all about you. So you're encouraging a child to be very self-focused, I suggest. Whereas we're suggesting no, schools are about your skills and ability to contribute to the community, to contribute to your own family, to contribute perhaps to the wider world. But let's think about the goals of school differently, and let's measure them differently. Internationally, education, schools attainment, individual child attainment is measured by competence in maths, science, and language. PISA, the Programme for International Student Assessment, measures both individuals and schools across 150 countries or more on that basis. But surely if relationships are key to the world's future, if they're crucial to an individual's ability to contribute in a company or a family or as a citizen in any context, then surely we should be putting relationships much more at the center of the way we think about schools. That affects student-to-student relationships, teacher-to-student relationships, teacher-to-teacher relationships, parents-to-school relationships, and the whole way the school participates with the community. There's a huge agenda there, which is taken up in our Relational Schools project. Or think about it in a business context. The International Integrated Reporting Council has brought to the front of the agenda the need to report not just on financial capital and human capital, intellectual capital, natural capital, but also relational and social capital. And in order to do that, you need to map it, then to measure it, and then to create dialogue between the stakeholders. If you want involvement, trust, and mutuality, which are the key to innovation and productivity, there's a big agenda there. In the American War of Independence, they had a slogan, and the slogan was, no taxation without representation. No taxation without representation. Well, we have a slogan in the relational world, which is no return without responsibility, no investment without involvement, no profit without participation. When they brought in limited liability in the 19th century to try and encourage more equity investment, they basically said to the shareholder, you do not need to engage with your company anymore because there's no downside risk. You just get the upside if it goes well. The most you can lose is your investment. So you don't need to spend time or bother yourself with what a company's doing. You can just put your money in the company and walk away and just wait for the money to come back because your risk is capped. There is a floor to how much you can lose, but there is no floor to how much you can gain. And so investors have done precisely that. They've kind of invested in various things. They may not even know where their investment is sometimes. For example, most of us may have a pension, and it's with some big provider like Standard Life, and actually you've got no idea where Standard Life is putting your money. All you're interested in is whether you get 4% or 5% rate of return, if you're lucky. We're saying, relationally, that is a disaster, Because money is always a form of social glue. It is always a way of building relationships across a society. And an unintended consequence of the stock market is to create relational distance between the provider of funds and the user of funds, in the same way as putting your money in a bank creates relational distance between the provider of the funds, who put it into the bank, and wherever the bank may choose to put it. The point is, we do not know where our money is going. We do not involve ourselves with how that money is used, and then we're surprised, upset, angry sometimes with the fact that people are creating pornographic websites, all kinds of betting websites, doing all kinds of things with our money that actually we totally disagree with. But we don't realize that it was our money that was fueling this process, and we had no idea that it was going on. So we're suggesting that we need to rework the way economies operate to reduce the length of this capital supply chain, where the money goes from my pension provider to a pension fund manager to a mutual and then into a company. So there's this long distance between one end and the other. We're suggesting that needs to be fundamentally reformed, and hence our slogan. And there's a government agenda where we would like to see relational impact assessment on all government policies. There is a start on that in the UK, where David Cameron has asked for a family impact assessment on legislation and government policy, and the Relationships Foundation is doing some important work trying to make that practical with the civil servants. But there's also a whole range of new policy priorities and working practices. And there is a new peace agenda where one is trying to build relationships among the protagonists through a process which we call, or which is known as, Track 2 diplomacy. So what is relational thinking? It's briefly defined. It's a framework for the organization of public policy and private life based on the relational values of the Judeo-Christian tradition. As I explained last night, you need to have some definition of the values that you have underneath a movement like this. That's where we're coming from. Obviously, other people in relational space, as it were, have different starting points. So you could say relational thinking is a set of institutions. You could say it's a national reform strategy, reforming one organization at a time, feeding down into households and feeding up into policy. You could think about it at multiple levels of application. You could think about it at the bottom in terms of individuals and families. Think about it at the level of organizations. Think about it at the level of whole sectors of society. It's a way of thinking about welfare, about education and health, and so on. It changes your definitions, and it particularly changes your goals of public services as well as of companies. You can think about it at a government or community level. So the ECPM, the European Christian Political Movement, is the first political party to adopt the relational paradigm, as you might call it, as the basis of its political agenda. They have 6 MEPs at the moment, I think about the size of Luxembourg, so a rather small part of the 750 members of the European Parliament. But 6 is still 6, and it's growing, and we hope it'll grow further, but they've taken on the relational theme as the foundation of their policy agenda. And you can think about it at another level as a philosophy or worldview. Copernicus was a famous Polish scientist in 1536 who came up with a ridiculous idea. We all know, if we look out of our windows in the morning, that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And therefore, of course, the sun goes around the earth, doesn't it? Well, so they thought for a very long time, but Copernicus said, hey guys, you're wrong, just look at the planets and the way they're moving. Actually, the earth is going round the sun. You've got it wrong. The sun is the center of our particular solar system, and the earth is going around the sun. And we're suggesting this rather extreme idea that instead of having finance at the center of our national solar system, if you like, or instead of having ourselves at the center of our personal solar system, that relationships are at the center of our world, and that relationships should go around, relationships should be at the middle, and finance should go around and serve the interests of relationships. We want to get relationships back at the center of people's thinking and get finance to serve relationships instead of making relationships serve finance. So I conclude by saying, well, it's a very practical issue. We want people to become, quotes, relationists. So join the Relational Thinking Network. If you haven't joined it already, please join it. We need members. We need partners. We're inviting you to engage with us. We encourage you to think about this and practice it in households and families. I think all of us find relationships challenging. I certainly do. And anyone who knows me well could rightfully point a finger and say, well, you're a real hypocrite standing up and talking about this. What about your own relationships? Put your own house in order. And they would be right. There is a constant struggle to practice good and right relationships. But at least it is an aspiration. And I'm saying it's important to have that aspiration. Engage in terms of the governance of institutions and in bringing about change within institutions. Encourage the mapping and measuring and dialoguing of relationships. Encourage two-way dialoguing. So it isn't just a matter of a consumer satisfaction survey or an employee attitude survey where it's the company doing a one-way relationship assessment. It needs to be two-way. So encourage dialogue and also challenge. Challenge the use of the word development. Challenge the use of the word poverty. Challenge the way governments make decisions based simply on financial criteria.